In the rugged heartland of Arkansas, where the Arkansas River twists like a serpent into the lawless frontier and meets the Poteau, stood one of the most terrifying monuments of Old West justice, the Fort Smith Federal Jail. Known to locals and outlaws alike as Hell on the Border, this grim fortress was more than a prison. It was a warning carved into stone and iron, echoing the brutal determination of a young nation trying to tame chaos. The site itself had been strategic long before it earned its dark reputation. Originally built as a military post in 1817 by Major William Bradford, and named in honor of General Thomas Smith, Fort Smith became a settlement, then a town, and finally, the epicenter of a judicial storm. By the late 1800s, the second iteration of the fort, completed in 1838 for $31,000, was transformed into a federal prison and courtroom, becoming the domain of the man who would define it, Judge Isaac C. Parker. They called him the Hanging Judge, and for good reason. When Parker arrived on May 4, 1875, he wasn't there to negotiate. His first act on the bench? Charging 8 men with murder in a single day. "I came here to dispense justice," he declared, "and that I shall do until the hour of my death." And he meant every word. Parker's jurisdiction was immense, $74,000 square miles, stretching across western Arkansas and into the treacherous Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. It was a vast and volatile region infested with outlaws, fugitives, and men who believed they were beyond the reach of any lawman. But Judge Parker aimed to prove otherwise. Fort Smith became a fortress of federal authority, one where the U.S. government flexed its might in a land too wild to listen, and the jail itself, a nightmare crafted from native stone and steel. Designed by architect Adolphus Kalkman, who was known for building military strongholds, the structure was an impenetrable slab of order in a swirling storm of violence. Its 3-foot-thick stone walls enclosed a maze of iron-barred cells, each one designed to hold a dozen prisoners, though often they held more. And at its heart, far below the sunlit courtyard, was the basement. They called it Hell on the Border. It wasn't a nickname, it was a sentence. This underground dungeon had no windows, no breeze, and barely enough ventilation to keep men conscious. When heavy rains came, it flooded, ankle deep, sometimes worse. Prisoners had no choice but to stand in it for days. Rats scurried freely. Light was a luxury. The air was a curse. One prisoner, William Whitehead, called it a dungeon that would shame the Spanish Inquisition. Another, James Casper, managed to smuggle out a diary. He wrote, "The rats here are better fed than the prisoners, and they have more freedom of movement." It was a place of despair and discipline, a place where law didn't just live. It ruled with an iron fist and a hanging rope. If the thick stone walls and iron bars of Fort Smith's jail were meant to confine men, then the gallows were built to remind them what came next. Just beyond the cold grip of their cells, justice waited with a noose, mouse, and it didn't blink. From the very start, Fort Smith was a place where punishment was public, constant, and terrifyingly efficient. Judge Parker didn't waste time. Over 21 years, he presided over a staggering 13,490 cases, a legal machine grinding relentlessly through an endless stream of outlaws. Of those, 344 were capital crimes, and 160 people were sentenced to die. Though only 79 executions were carried out, the specter of death loomed over every prisoner like a ghost with a clock. The courtroom wasn't just a place for legal arguments. It was a conveyor belt to the gallows. On some months, Parker's court could process as many as 200 cases, a furious pace that turned justice into a blood-soaked assembly line, and it all funneled into the execution yard. In 1886, the prison's carpenter, George Malladin, constructed a gallows that could hang 6 men at once. As fate would have it, that exact number would swing from its beams in its most infamous moment. September 3, 1875. The largest mass execution in Fort Smith's history. 6 convicted murderers, James Moore, Daniel Evans, William Whittington, Edmund Campbell, Samuel Fooey, and William Leach, stood shoulder to shoulder, ropes tight around their necks, while inmates watched from their cell windows. The gallows, were built close enough to be seen from the jail, a constant visual threat, hanging like a promise just outside. Every prisoner could see it, every time they looked out. After the executions, their bodies were buried in a patch of land grimly, nicknamed Hangman's Grove. A lone wooden marker stood watch. No names, no eulogies, just a monument to silence. Inside the jail, life was barely more forgiving. Cells designed for 12 often held more. Air was scarce, space was sacred. Men lived shoulder to shoulder, fighting off rats and sickness with the same desperation they once used to rob stagecoaches or dodge bullets. The worst was the basement dungeon, that infamous hell on the border. With no sunlight, barely any airflow, and the ever-present threat of flooding, it became a psychological torture chamber. Prisoners didn't sleep. They endured. There was no rest. Only waiting. Waiting for a verdict. Waiting for parole. Or waiting for the day when the jailer would call their name and lead them to the stairs that ended at a wooden platform and a loop of rope. Because at Fort Smith, you could forget your past, but the gallows never forgot your name. Behind the bars, of Fort Smith's dreaded jail, some of the Wild West's most infamous names became more than just wanted posters. They became stories whispered in fear, admiration, and sometimes pity. The most notorious of them all was Cherokee Bill, born Crawford Goldsby in 1876 at Fort Concho, Texas. Raised in a mixed-race family, he drifted into outlaw life as a teenager, earning his blood-soaked reputation by age 18 after a fatal shooting. From 1894 to 1895, his gang carved a trail of chaos through Indian territory, robbing, killing, and vanishing like smoke. Captured by Constable Ike Rogers, Cherokee Bill was caged in Fort Smith in 1895, but the jail could barely contain his fire. On July 26, 1895, in a bold escape attempt, he shot and killed guard Lawrence Keating with a revolver smuggled into his cell, hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible, courtesy of a visitor named Nancy Mary Brown. He was hanged on March 17, 1896. His final words: "This is about as good a day to die as any." His last meal, hot biscuits, fried chicken, and coffee, became a grim tradition for future condemned men. Then there was Belle Starr, the infamous Bandit Queen. Born Myra Maybelle Shirley in 1848 near Carthage, Missouri, she was arrested for horse theft in 1886. Unlike her male counterparts, Belle was housed separately, in what guards mockingly called the ladies' suite, a cramped 6'8" cell with a narrow window and little else. She spent her days reading Shakespeare and scribbling poetry. Her favorite, Macbeth. She'd often quote Lady Macbeth to the guards, daring them with lines drenched in ambition and blood. One marshal recalled her saying, "This place hasn't reformed me. It's just taught me to be more careful." Belle was released, but the West didn't forgive. She was murdered on February 3, 1889, shot near her home in Younger's Bend. The killer was never caught. Another figure that would burn into history's conscience was James Moore, a boy condemned by time and circumstance. In 1892, at just 16 years old, Moore was convicted of killing a traveling salesman named Herbert Crowley during a botched robbery. His trial lasted 3 days. His mother, Sarah Moore, traveled 180 miles by wagon to beg Judge Parker for mercy. Photograph was taken, Sarah on her knees before the courthouse pleading for her son's life. That photo now rests in the Smithsonian Institution, but her tears changed nothing. Despite a prison physician's testimony that Moore was mentally underdeveloped, Parker refused to stay the execution. Moore's last words were passed along by the prison chaplain, "Tell my mother I died brave." He was hanged on July 7, 1892, and the backlash helped spark reforms in juvenile justice across the frontier. These weren't just criminals. They were characters in a brutal drama, their fates tangled in a world where law was harsh, survival was rare, and mercy was often drowned out by the clatter of chains and the thud of boots on gallows steps. At Fort Smith, the jail didn't just confine the body, It etched stories into history, one execution, one heartbreak, one legend at a time. If Fort Smith's stone walls were its bones, then the U.S. Marshals who patrolled its halls were its beating heart, tough, unrelenting, and always watching. Among them was a man who has since become legend, Deputy Marshal Bass Reeves. Born into slavery in 1838 in Crawford County, Arkansas, Reeves became the first black deputy U.S. Marshal west of the Mississippi River. Over 32 years of service, he captured more than 3,000 fugitives, all without ever being wounded, a record unmatched in frontier history. Fluent in Cherokee Creek and Seminole, Reeves could track a man through dense woods, speak to locals in their native tongue, and disappear into disguise like a ghost. One time, he arrested an entire outlaw family, a mother and her 2 sons, by dressing as a wandering preacher and tricking them into lowering their guard. A fellow lawman once said, Bass could track a butterfly through a tornado, but even heroes couldn't soften the daily brutality of prison life. Inside Fort Smith, prisoners endured a grim and grinding routine. The food was barely edible, cornbread, beans, and salt pork, served day after day, prepared by the prison's longtime cook, Samuel Old Sam Jackson, who held the post from 1875 to 1894. The government allotted just 15 cents per prisoner, per day, roughly $4 in today's money. And even that didn't go far when disease thrived in every cell block corner. Summer heat turned the jail into an oven. Temperatures inside the cells could reach over 100 degrees, thick with the stench of sweat, blood, and despair. Diseases swept through the population like wildfire, tuberculosis and typhoid fever being the deadliest. Between 1873 and 1896, over 100 inmates died from illness alone. The man tasked with treating them, Dr. James Massey, chronicled the horrors in chilling detail. In one report he wrote, "The conditions here breed more death than the gallows." His medical logs recorded a grim blend of outdated techniques and dangerous experimentation. Mercury compounds, for example, were regularly used to treat everything from infections to fevers despite their toxic effects. If the rope didn't kill you, the water, the rats, or the medicine might. Yet even in this pit of suffering, the system ran like clockwork, swift, relentless, and efficient. Guards stood their ground. The gallows creaked with use, and the marshals rode out each morning to bring back the next soul fated for a cell, a trial, or a noose. At Fort Smith, justice wasn't blind. It was mercilessly awake. And every chain link echoed with the cost of order in a world where chaos had once reigned. Fort Smith was a fortress, yes, but it was also a crossroads of desperation, rebellion, and raw humanity. The prison's population mirrored the chaotic mosaic of the frontier. In its 24 years of operation, 3,467 men and women were locked behind its walls. Among them were members of 23 Native American tribes, 13 European nationalities, and countless American ethnic groups, all bound together by chains, shadows, and survival. One of the most compelling figures was Blue Duck, born Shakan Ga, an outlaw of Cherokee and Mexican descent. His crimes were brutal, his capture inevitable, but his fate was unusual. Only 21 years old, Blue Duck was spared the gallows after a petition signed by 273 Cherokee citizens, including Chief Dennis Bushyhead, convinced Judge Parker to issue a rare reprieve. Instead of death, Blue Duck received a life sentence and was transferred to a prison in Illinois where he died of tuberculosis in 1895. His final words, preserved in a letter written in Cherokee, read, "I die far from my people under white man's stone walls." But not all tried to wait out their sentence. In 1888, inmate Jack Ryan made a move that would become part of prison legend. Alongside 4 others, Thomas Crump, George Paget, Henry Starr, a cousin of Belle Starr, and William Starr, Ryan, spent 3 months digging a tunnel beneath the prison. Their tools, stolen spoons and a jagged piece of iron scavenged from a broken bed frame. They hid the dirt by stuffing it into their clothes and quietly dumping it into the prison garden. Inch by inch, they carved toward freedom. They were just 8 feet from the outside wall when guard Timothy O'Leary stumbled on the tunnel during a routine inspection, on December 12, 1888. Their sentence was swift and brutal: death by hanging. All 5 were executed on April 15, 1889. Rian's final words to hangman George Malladon were chilling. "At least we died trying." Yet it wasn't only men who fought to escape. Some fought just to be heard. Between 1872 and 1896, 72 women were incarcerated at Fort Smith. Among them was Anna Dawson, whose case became a flashpoint for public debate. Convicted of poisoning her husband with arsenic-laced coffee, Anna's story unfolded under a national spotlight. Evidence revealed years of savage domestic abuse. Her defense attorney, William H. Clayton, usually the lead prosecutor, brought 23 witnesses to testify about her husband's cruelty. The Fort Smith elevator, the local paper, followed every twist of the trial. Editor John Wheeler openly called for clemency, and in an extraordinary act of compassion, even Judge Parker's own wife, Mary, signed the petition to save Anna's life. The campaign worked. President Grover Cleveland commuted her death sentence to life imprisonment, swayed by 7,000 signatures and a growing tide of sympathy. Anna Dawson became a symbol, not just of mercy but of how justice in the right moment could bend toward humanity. These were not just names in a ledger. They were voices, echoing from iron cells and dirt floors. Voices that clawed against fate, that dared to dig, protest, plead, or simply endure. And Fort Smith, for all its cruelty, remembered them. Inside the cold, unforgiving walls of Fort Smith, it wasn't all about punishments and hangings. The prison had its own strange rhythm of survival, one that gave some inmates the chance to earn trust, while others watched the shadow of the gallows grow longer by the day. At the heart of this system was something surprisingly modern: the trustee program. Introduced by head jailer John Harrington, the system gave well-behaved inmates small slices of freedom in exchange for discipline and labor. Instead of striped uniforms, trustees wore distinctive brown shirts, a quiet symbol of status among the damned. For every month of good service, a trustee earned 2 days off their sentence. Records show that 189 inmates served as trustees, and only 12 ever tried to escape. The most remarkable of them was Henry Starr, who worked as the prison's librarian. He founded the jail's first lending library, starting with just 84 donated books. In his later autobiography, Thrilling Events: Life of Henry Starr, he wrote, "It was the first time I felt a man's worth could be judged by his responsibility instead of his past." But while trustees read and worked, the gallows never stopped looming. Execution Day in Fort Smith was not a quiet affair. It was a spectacle, part justice, part carnival, and all horror. Local merchants sold hanging day souvenirs, tiny pieces of rope, copied court drawings, and even gallows pies baked to match the condemned man's final meal. The Fort Smith Herald spared no detail. One issue recounted how Dr. James Maxwell, a court-appointed witness, would time every hanging with his gold pocket watch, noting that death occurred between 4 and 6 minutes after the drop. The gallows themselves were a grim masterpiece. Built by carpenter-turned-hangman George Malladon, they stood just outside the jail's windows, a visible warning to every prisoner. Designed to accommodate 6 simultaneous executions, the platform was part stage, part sentence. Malladon, known as the Prince of Hangmen, took his role seriously. He calculated the length of the drop based on each prisoner's height and weight, aiming for instant death. In a rare 1894 interview, he said, "I never lost a man to a slow death." But prison records whisper otherwise, at least 3. Executions under his watch went horribly wrong. Even the building itself felt like it had been engineered for control. Discovered decades later in a dusty courthouse attic, the original blueprints by architect Adolphus Kalkman revealed a 3-tiered cell block design. Guards stood on a central platform, able to watch every cell at once. An 1885 innovation, a pulley system designed by prison engineer Marcus Thompson, allowed guards to open and shut multiple cell doors at once, a security feature so ahead of its time that other jails soon copied it. And below it all, in the limestone-clad depths of the hell-on-the-border basement, prisoners scratched their final thoughts into stone. Some etched prayers, others carved curses. One simply wrote, "I came here a man, I leave a memory." Fort Smith was a machine built for justice, but within its gears, men still tried to find meaning. Whether in a book, a duty, or a desperate final sentence on a crumbling wall. In a world where outlaws reigned and justice often came too late, Deputy Marshal Bass Reeves stood as a towering contradiction, unshakable, unkillable, and utterly relentless. While most men chased fugitives with noise and bullets, Reeves used intellect, disguise, and fluency in tribal languages to hunt his targets like a shadow that never slept. By 1883, Reeves had become more than a lawman. He was a one-man intelligence network. He formed alliances with Native American inmates, setting up informants inside the prison. These relationships helped him prevent multiple escape attempts, catch whispered plots before they formed, and even track fugitives hiding in the dense unmapped corners of Indian Territory. His most legendary pursuit ended with a gunfight. The target, Bob Dozier, a career criminal and one of the West's most elusive outlaws. Reeves hunted him for 11 days through the unforgiving wilderness of Cherokee Nation, finally confronting him in a shootout near Muskogee on December 20, 1878. Dozier was executed the following year. Reeves simply wrote in his report, "The law is like a blanket. It covers all men equally." But while Reeves enforced justice with precision, George Malladin, the prison's executioner, embodied its finality. Nicknamed the Prince of Hangmen, Malladin executed 60 of the 79 men who died on Fort Smith's gallows. He was a craftsman of death, carrying a personal notebook of hanging calculations, entries listing prisoners' height, weight, and neck strength to ensure a swift, clean break with each drop. His methodical approach was so respected that other states, including the Texas State Penitentiary at Huntsville, asked him for advice. His goal, as he told the St. Louis Republic in 1894, was to ensure that no man suffered after the trap was sprung. "I never lost a man to a slow death," he claimed. Yet behind the bravado, prison files recorded at least 3 hangings that went horribly wrong, including one where the rope failed and had to be reset, while the condemned man stood trembling, knowing death was circling again. Still, Malladin carried out his duties with eerie calm. To him, the gallows weren't cruel. They were necessary, a tool for preserving order in a world barely holding together. So it was that 2 men, one chasing life, the other delivering death, became symbols of frontier justice. Reeves captured them, Malladin ended them, and Fort Smith, in all its grim efficiency, became the stage for their grim ballet. For all its chains and cruelty, Fort Smith Federal Jail wasn't entirely sealed off from the outside world. On certain days, when the gallows were silent and the corridors momentarily calm, humanity slipped in through the gates. According to the official rules and regulations of the United States Jail at Fort Smith, visitors were allowed twice a week, Sundays and Wednesdays from 1 to 4 p.m. Families came clutching hope. Lawyers arrived with papers. And clergy offered the only comfort many prisoners would ever know. But there were other visitors too, people whose presence left a lasting mark. Between 1884 and 1889, guard William McGregor kept a detailed visitor ledger, recording over 8,500 names. Among them were Frank James, brother of Jesse, who came to see old gang members, and Chief Quanah Parker, who advocated for imprisoned members of the Comanche tribe. And then there was Sarah Bernhardt, not the famed French actress, but a quiet schoolteacher from nearby Van Buren. Every Sunday for 15 years, she came to read aloud to inmates who couldn't read themselves. She brought books, poetry, and an unwavering belief that words could still change men, even on the brink of death. But hope had to fight for breath inside these walls, especially when it came to health. The prison's infirmary, added in 1880, was nothing more than a converted storage room that could barely hold 8 patients, and when disease came, it came fast. In the summer of 1888, a typhoid outbreak killed 17 inmates, forcing others to be quarantined in makeshift tents in the prison yard. Dr. James Massey, the prison's longtime physician, walked a line between outdated tradition and early medical innovation. He relied on bloodletting, mercury treatments, and trial-and-error remedies. But not all his methods were madness. His controversial use of carbolic acid as a disinfectant, though ridiculed at the time, likely saved dozens of lives by preventing further outbreaks. His detailed autopsy records, now preserved in the National Archives, are a window into the brutal health realities of 19th century incarceration, malnutrition, infection, and untreated trauma. Yet amid all this suffering, tiny sparks of progress flickered. Chaplain Francis Springer ran a literacy program that taught inmates to read and write. In the prison's workshop, others learned vocational trades, blacksmithing, carpentry, leatherwork. A small library, started by former trustee Henry Starr, grew from 84 volumes to over 400. It included religious texts, practical manuals, and even popular novels. The most borrowed book? The Count of Monte Cristo, a tale of escape, revenge, and redemption. Because even in the darkest corners of Fort Smith, where death waited on wood and iron, there were still those who believed in second chances. People who saw prisoners not just as criminals, but as men broken by the world, trying to stand again. Sometimes the gallows claimed them anyway, but sometimes they walked free, carrying with them the stories, scars, and whispers of a place where justice was hard and mercy even harder. If Fort Smith was a dungeon of stone and gallows, then Yuma Territorial Prison was a furnace of sand and steel, a blazing scar carved into the Sonoran Desert, where justice burned as hot as the sun. Perched high on a rocky bluff at the confluence of the Colorado and Gila rivers, the prison opened its gates on July 1, 1876, welcoming its first inmate, William Hall, convicted of stealing 2 army mules. Hall would serve his full 2-year sentence, and later write to his sister, "Even the devil himself would find this place too hot for his liking." That was no exaggeration. With summer temperatures soaring above 120 degrees, and interior cells, often reaching 140-degree Alfair, Yuma quickly earned its reputation as the hellhole. The prison wasn't just in the desert. It was of the desert, carved from its stone and scorched by its sun. In a twist of cruel irony, the first men confined there were also its builders. The earliest inmates, led by a convicted murderer named Francisco Flores, were ordered to build their own cells, blasting and carving them from the merciless desert rock. They lived in excavated caves along the riverbank during construction, crude holes with no relief from the brutal heat. Guard James McGee, writing in his journal, captured the absurdity. These men are building their own hell, stone by stone, under a merciless sun. Despite its nightmarish climate, Yuma was surprisingly progressive by 19th century standards. It had electricity, running water, and even one of the first public libraries in the Arizona Territory, luxuries many law-abiding citizens didn't have. By 1879, the prison library had grown to over 2,000 books, with titles in English, Spanish, German, and Chinese. There was even a prison band, the Iron Band, led by inmate William Banjo Bill Crawford, a cattle rustler who became the unlikely composer of Sunday concerts that drew crowds from as far as Phoenix and San Diego. But those small comforts couldn't mask the suffering inside the walls. Cells measured a tight 9 by 12 feet, with iron bunks stacked 3 high and barely enough room to breathe. 6 prisoners might be packed into one cell, sweating through suffocating nights where the air felt like hot ash, and the metal doors grew too hot to touch by noon. Among the many to pass through Yuma's gates was Pearl Hart, the infamous female stagecoach robber. In her memoir, she wrote, "The iron doors sizzled in summer heat. The air was so thick you breathed it like a wet blanket." Despite her notoriety, Pearl received special treatment, a private cell and a small yard where she grew flowers, a rare softness in a place where nothing else bloomed. The men and women at Yuma weren't just fighting for time. They were fighting to endure a prison that punished with climate as much as it did with steel. And as we'll see, the brutality only deepened with each punishment, each prisoner, and each desperate attempt to escape the desert's grip. Yuma Territorial Prison was more than just a cage in the desert. It was a place where punishment was a performance, survival was a skill, And even in chains, inmates carved out culture, with grit and defiance. Behind its iron doors lived an astonishing range of prisoners: Mexican revolutionaries, Mormon polygamists, Chinese immigrants, and American outlaws, each bringing their own story, their own struggle, and their own scars. One of the prison's most notorious inmates was Augustin Chacon, a charismatic bandit who claimed to have killed over 50 men. Then there was William Jordan Flake, a respected Mormon leader, imprisoned for the crime of plural marriage. And Wang Li, a Chinese immigrant, was locked away for running an opium den in Tucson's Chinatown. But perhaps no story was as unforgettable as Elena Estrada's. Convicted in a storm of scandal, Estrada had cut out her unfaithful lover's heart in a passionate fury in Tucson's Barrio Viejo. Her punishment? Time in Yuma. Her legacy? A needle. Prison records note that Elena became an expert seamstress, teaching others how to sew with elegance, even within prison walls soaked in violence. Yet for those who crossed the line inside the prison, Yuma had a special kind of hell: the dark cell. Constructed in 1878, this windowless isolation chamber was reserved for troublemakers. Pitch black, barely ventilated, and teeming with bats, scorpions, and black widow spiders, it stripped prisoners down to their underwear, shackled them in chains, and left them alone in silence for days. John Ryan, a rebellious inmate who spent 104 hours inside, later wrote in a hidden diary, "Time loses all meaning in that black hole. The silence screams. The darkness tastes like death." Despite this brutality, Yuma fostered a strange undercurrent of creativity and community. Prisoners made and sold handicrafts, lace, jewelry, horsehair bridles, to locals through the prison's prison store. One inmate, Antonio Romero, became locally famous for his intricate bridles, fetching up to $50 apiece, a small fortune in the 1880s. And then there was Frank Murphy, a convicted forger who had once worked for Thomas Edison. In 1884, he installed Yuma's first electrical plant, lighting the prison long before the town itself had power. Locals joked, "The prison lives better than the people." And they weren't wrong. Yuma even had a band, the Iron Band, and a library that rivaled nearby towns. Music drifted across the desert, and books turned hardened men into readers, dreamers, even poets. But that didn't mean freedom. Between 1876 and 1909, there were 29 escapes. Most failed. The most legendary belonged to Jesus Rodriguez, who filed through his cell bars using women's hair soaked in acid, smuggled in by a sympathetic visitor named Maria Moreno. His escape lasted 3 months before he was tracked down in Mexico. Others were bolder, like the Gallagher brothers, who vanished during a dust storm, only to be captured 2 weeks later by legendary Apache scout Tom Horn. Yuma was many things: a prison, a furnace, a school, and a nightmare. It broke men, it built some, and it left behind a paradox, a place where cruelty and creativity coexisted, forged together by the sun, the stone, and the relentless will to survive. High in the rugged silence of Montana's Deer Lodge Valley, beneath the sprawling skies and jagged peaks of the Flint Creek Range, stood a fortress that felt more like a warning than a place of justice: the Montana Territorial Prison. Built in 1871, this weathered behemoth of sandstone and iron loomed over the town like a sentinel. From the moment its first prisoner, a horse thief named Samuel Hughes, stepped through the gates on July 2, 1871, the prison became a crucible for criminals, reformers, and violence alike. Construction began in 1870, led by architect Hubert B. Miller, with inmates themselves quarrying the stone and erecting the walls they'd one day be trapped behind. It cost $40,000 to build, roughly $850,000 today, and was already overcrowded before it opened. But it was under Warden Frank Conley, who reigned from 1890 to 1921, that the prison became a paradox: harsh, brutal, yet weirdly visionary. Conley believed in breaking bodies to control minds. His infamous convict labor system turned the prison into a massive industrial machine. Inmates built not only more prison wings but also Deer Lodge's courthouse, waterworks, and roads. He kept a diary where he scrawled his cold philosophy: idle hands breed dangerous minds. Better to wear out their bodies than let their minds plot mischief. It worked, and it didn't. The prison expanded fast, eventually adding a women's ward, a maximum security block nicknamed the Tank, and even a fully functioning theater. Yes, a theater. Funded by copper baron William Clark, the Clark Theater became a strange symbol of the prison's dual nature, equal parts cage and community. Inmates performed vaudeville, Shakespeare, and original plays, often for public audiences. Even Senator Harry Truman attended a 1939 production of Hamlet, sitting in a sea of iron and applause. But this place wasn't built for hope, and it often proved it. Among its most notorious inmates was Harvey Kid Curry Logan, a member of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. In 1903, he slipped away during a baseball game played between inmates and townspeople. Guard Timothy O'Brien later admitted, he walked off in the 7th inning like he was going to buy peanuts. Logan was never seen again, and the women's ward? That, too, was its own battlefield. Julia Slick Morgan, convicted for a massive fraud scheme that fleeced Montana miners of $50,000, kept a journal. The cells freeze in winter and bake in summer. They treat us like animals, but we find ways to stay women. For all its rules, all its systems, Deer Lodge couldn't stop the chaos from occasionally bursting through, and when it did, it left blood on the walls and echoes in the stone. The worst came in 1959, a riot that lasted 36 hours, led by inmates Jerry Miles and Lee Smart. They killed Deputy Warden Ted Roth, took hostages, and held the prison in a death grip until the National Guard stormed it with tear gas and rifles. Guard George Alton, one of the hostages, later wrote in his memoir, "The sound of gunfire in that stone tomb was like the devil's own orchestra." But even after the blood dried and the prison doors slammed shut again, Deer Lodge kept going. Because the Montana Territorial Prison wasn't just a place of punishment, it was a place of contradictions. Theater and torture, work and war, silence and screaming, all trapped beneath the cold breath of the mountains. As the decades wore on, the walls of Montana Territorial Prison began to crack, not just with age, but under the weight of changing times, failing infrastructure, and a rising chorus demanding reform. By the early 20th century, Warden Frank Conley's harsh methods had begun to give way to modern ideas. He introduced a progressive merit system in 1908, crafted by Deputy Warden Michael Sullivan, which categorized inmates into 4 classes based on their behavior and work ethic. Prisoners could climb their way from 4th-class lockdown to 1st-class privileges, like tobacco, extra yard time, and choice work assignments. Sullivan wrote, "A man will climb any ladder if you show him the top rung," and many did. Through work on the prison's 30,000-acre ranch, men learned farming, carpentry, and blacksmithing. The dairy herd, started with just 12 cows in 1902, grew to 200, producing enough to feed the inmates and supply the town of Deer Lodge. Agricultural records from 1918 show prison farm revenues topping $75,000, nearly $2 million today. Even the prison's diet, once plain and pitiful, improved. Holiday menus began to include roast turkey, mashed potatoes, and apple pie. But the darkness wasn't gone. It simply had more space to hide. In 1912, the prison built its maximum security unit known as the Tank. Inside were death row cells, where 39 executions were carried out between 1915 and 1943. The gallows, handmade by inmates, had 13 steps leading to the platform. That number became legend and a curse. The man who built it, a convict named Philip Coleman, was also its last victim. Before his execution, he told Warden Conley, "It's a fine day to die, Warden. Shame to waste it on such ugly business." Discipline remained brutal. The silent system banned talking except during scheduled times. Inmates who broke the rule were thrown into the hole, a pitch-black basement cell with no light, no sanitation, and no sound but their own breathing. And yet, there were strange signs of life within the gray walls. A baseball team, the Prison All-Stars, formed in 1908, played regular games against local clubs. In 1912, they went 28-3, a record that stunned spectators. For a few innings, guards and inmates cheered for the same team. When World War I erupted, 76 inmates volunteered to fight for their country. 23 were pardoned to join the military. Others stayed and contributed by growing victory gardens and buying war bonds, $5,000 worth earned from wages behind bars. But the prison could not outrun time. By the 1970s, inspectors found over 100 safety violations. The walls were crumbling. Pipes burst in winter. Cells overheated in summer. A 1975 riot over overcrowding caused $450,000 in damages, finally forcing lawmakers to act. On September 10, 1979, the final 386 inmates were transferred to a new facility nearby. The last door slammed shut. A century of pain, punishment, and paradox was over. But the prison did not die. Today, the old Montana prison stands as a museum, drawing tens of thousands of visitors a year. Tour guides lead people through ghostly cell blocks, the infamous Clark Theater and Corridor 4, where some say they still hear the phantom whistling of long-dead inmates. Artifacts, like chess sets carved from soap, the infamous punishment, log and escape tools fashioned from spoons, fill display cases. Even the cell of Carl Slippery Johnson, the man who tried to escape 5 times, remains intact, graffiti and all. Because these weren't just prisoners. They were stories. And these weren't just prisons. They were crucibles, where the law met defiance and every brick echoed with the brutal balance of justice and survival.